So wait, so the supervisor who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's house had never investigated a homicide?
Correct.
How is that possible?
Well, so you have decisions made by people that will install friends and people that can do stuff for them, opposed to people that are there on their merit and can do the job correctly.
Correct. The supervisor who led the first response to Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st had never investigated a homicide before being put in charge of the homicide unit. And the people working under that supervisor knew it. They watched. And 62 days later, they are still living with what that cost. But here is the thing. That is not even the most disturbing part of what this insider revealed. Because the failure at that scene on February 1st did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a crime that was specifically designed to be misread. A crime that had been planned for weeks by someone who knew exactly how that first team would respond when they walked through the door. Today is day 62 in the search for Nancy Guthrie. And this video is going to show you something that the public record has been hiding inside a single word that Sheriff Nanos used once at a press conference and that the entire country quietly forgot he ever said. The word is assume. And once you hear it in the right context, the 2-hour window between Nancy's garage door closing and the masked man appearing at her front camera is never going to look the same again. Please, before we proceed, I want you to leave whatever you are doing right now and drop a prayer of faith for Nancy Guthrie. Your prayers might be the key to bringing her home. Amen. 4 days after Nancy disappeared, Sheriff Nanos laid out the official timeline at a press conference. The garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. and closed at 9:50 p.m. And then he said this: "It is at that time we assume Nancy is home and probably going to bed." Assume, his exact word. Not confirmed. Not evidenced by any camera or electronic signal. He assumed she was home. And from that press conference forward, every retelling of this case quietly dropped that word and replaced it with a statement of fact. Nancy was home. Nancy was asleep. Nancy was safe until the masked man arrived. But here is what the confirmed record actually shows between 9:50 p.m. and the masked man appearing after midnight. Nothing. No camera. No electronic signal. No external data point that places Nancy alive and safe inside that house for those 2 hours. And that entire window has been treated as empty and passive. Nancy going to bed, nothing happening, the crime still ahead of her. What if it was not empty? What if the 2-hour gap that everyone assumed was safe was actually the most active window of this entire operation? Because when you look at what was already positioned around Nancy Guthrie before that garage door came down, the question stops being theoretical. The Pima County Sheriff's Department made a specific public request to neighborhood residents. Submit surveillance footage from January 11th between 9 p.m. and midnight, and from January 31st between 9:30 a.m. and 11 a.m. Those are not broad date ranges. You do not name a specific date and a 3-hour window unless you already know something happened during that period. And investigators had already developed a reason to focus on those exact dates before they asked anyone else to look. January 11th. 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared. Someone was near her home at night. Then January 24th. Then the morning of January 31st itself, hours before Nancy even left for dinner, a suspicious vehicle was confirmed in the neighborhood while she was still inside her house. Think about that. The morning of the same day, she disappeared. A vehicle positioned near her home before her evening had even started. Not reacting to her movements, preceding them, confirming a plan that was already in motion. This operation did not begin when the masked man walked up to the camera. It began at least 3 weeks before that, and whoever was running it knew Nancy's schedule, knew her Saturday night routine, knew exactly when she would be home. That kind of knowledge does not come from watching a house from the street for one night. It comes from being close to this family. Very close. At 5:32 p.m. on January 31st, Nancy Guthrie called an Uber and rode to Annie and Tommaso's house for dinner. That Uber driver had a dash camera. Law enforcement obtained that footage 47 days after Nancy disappeared. 47 days. For 7 weeks, the visual record of Nancy's last evening, the exact route she traveled, the streets around her Uber, the vehicles that were near or following her ride, sat unexamined.
You know, were the initial people who responded inexperienced?
The people that were there on the scene were not 10-year homicide detectives. They didn't have a lot of experience in homicide at that point, to include the supervisor, who, from my understanding, never investigated homicide before being installed as the supervisor for the homicide unit.
So wait, so the supervisor who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's house had never investigated a homicide?
Correct.
How is that possible?
Well, so you have decisions made by people that will install friends and people that can do stuff for them, opposed to people that are there on their merit and can do the job correctly.
That window between 5:32 p.m. and 9:50 p.m. when Tommaso dropped her home is the window during which anyone tracking her movements would have been most active, and the dash cam covers it. Investigators are now analyzing it frame by frame. What they find along that route has not been made public, but the question it raises is one this investigation has been dancing around for 2 months. Was Nancy being followed that evening? Was someone tracking the Uber? Did the operation that had been running since January 11th have eyes on her right up until the moment that garage door came down?
Thanks for hopping on with me. I wanted to get your reaction to this interview that we did with this source that's very close to the Nancy Guthrie investigation. One thing the person told us is that the people who responded to Nancy's house initially were the detectives were inexperienced. Specifically, the homicide supervisor had never worked a homicide before. Does that surprise you?
I would wonder how that person was put in charge of homicide if they've never worked a homicide case. To me, that sounds like a political appointment. I don't know the facts, but I never heard of something like that. You work your way up through, and the ones who rise to the top, whoever they may be, generally are the ones you want working homicide. And because the job of the homicide supervisor is not just to click stats and stuff like that. Their job is to monitor the cases of the investigators and make sure that they are following cogent leads, that they have a good strategy for the case, and that they're not going off the deep end on rabbit trails. And so how can you do that if you're the one who somebody else should be, monitoring?
Yeah, I would think the supervisor, by definition, would be someone with a lot of experience.
And, it's funny, in the FBI, there's a lot of consternation about sometimes agents just off probation putting in for supervisory positions when most agents on competitive squads, first of all, they don't want to be supervisors. They want to work the cases. And secondarily, it'll take you 10 years working your way up through the skills, through you have to make cases. Somebody who's never made a case on the homicide squad is not going to be considered for the supervisor. So then you have to wonder why somebody who's never even worked a case got made a supervisor.
The first team at that scene rushed to a judgment. Nancy wandered off, and they ran everything that followed as a search and rescue operation instead of a criminal investigation. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore broke down exactly what that means. If you are looking for someone who wandered off, you search 20 yards around the house, and you do not treat anything as a crime scene. You bring people in. You stand in the driveway. You walk right over the evidence without knowing it. And every person who moves through that property in search mode is contaminating what a criminal investigation would have been collecting. And here is what makes that mistake so much worse than just an inexperienced judgment call. The blood was on the front step. The Ring camera had been physically ripped from the wall. The family was telling investigators from the first moment. She cannot walk to the mailbox on a good day. She has no dementia. She did not wander. Moore said it bluntly. It is not rocket science. There is blood. She is missing. The camera is ripped off the wall. That is not a wander-off. That is a crime scene. And yet the supervisor, who according to the insider had never investigated a homicide before being put in charge of the homicide unit, looked at all of that and went with the wandered-off assumption. Now here is the question nobody has asked directly. The crime that was planned here, the staged back doors, the front camera covered, the scene designed with enough ambiguity to look uncertain, was it designed specifically knowing that the first team through that door would make exactly that assumption? Because whoever planned this knew Nancy Guthrie. They knew her routine. They knew her home. And if they also knew how the Pima County Sheriff's Department responds to an elderly woman who appears to have gone missing, if this was designed from the inside to be misread, then the wandered-off assumption was not a mistake the investigation made. It was a mistake the people responsible for this crime built into their plan. Savannah Guthrie told the country the back doors were propped open when Annie arrived that morning. Not unlocked. Not ajar. Propped. Deliberately held open. There is one question about those doors that this investigation has never answered publicly. When were they propped? If those doors were propped before 9:50 p.m., before Nancy came home, then someone had already been inside that property or accessed it before her garage door closed. She would have walked into a house where the back had already been staged by someone who intended to return or was already waiting. The pajamas are still there in that scenario. The belongings are still there. The physical scene looks identical from the outside. But the sequence changes completely. The garage door closing at 9:50 p.m. does not seal Nancy inside a safe home. It seals her inside a crime that was already set. A former FBI special agent stated directly, the back doors were not an exit. They were an entry point. The blood at the front confirms the exit was through the front. So the operational picture is this. Now someone enters through the back before or alongside the masked man at the front. The masked man manages the camera and the exterior. The entry through the back is where the interior access happened, and those doors were already open before any of it began. Who knew the back of that property well enough to stage it in the dark? Who had been inside that house enough times that the back entrance and the interior layout were not something they needed to figure out on the night? That question does not require this video to answer it. The confirmed record has been pointing at the answer since January 11th. Within 24 hours of Nancy's disappearance, a ransom note arrived at a Tucson news station and at TMZ. That note contained specific details about Nancy's clothing the night she was taken, specific details about the interior of her home. And it demanded $6 million in Bitcoin by February 9th at 5 p.m. A Bitcoin wallet does not get created the night of a crime. A specific payment deadline is not calculated in the hours after an abduction. A $6 million figure is not guessed. It is researched. It is the number you arrive at when you have spent time understanding the difference between a family's public net worth and what they can actually access in liquid funds. Someone calculated that number in advance. Cameron Guthrie knew it immediately when Savannah asked him, "Did this happen because of me?" He said it probably did, because whoever built this operation had researched this family before January 11th. They knew Savannah's salary. Someone searched it online in December. They knew the property. They knew the routine. And the ransom note is not the product of someone reacting to a crime they just committed. It is the product of someone who had the infrastructure ready before the night began. And the specific details about Nancy's clothing and her home in that note, those details come from someone who was inside this family's world. The geography of where an investigation deploys resources tells you where the evidence is pointing. And what happened in this case geographically has never been fully discussed together. FBI Director Kash Patel traveled personally to Tucson. Directors manage from Washington. That trip signals the evidence is significant enough for direct oversight at the highest level. FBI operations later relocated to Phoenix, a major transportation hub with international connections. And law enforcement on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border was briefed on the suspect footage. A helicopter with a signal sniffer was deployed to search for the specific electromagnetic signal of Nancy's pacemaker model. The Madres Buscadoras, a Mexican search organization that finds remains in desert terrain, traveled from Mexico specifically to assist and were turned away by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Bitcoin transactions are borderless. $6 million demanded in cryptocurrency by someone who set up a wallet in advance reflects someone with the digital literacy and operational planning to move money across any border. The crime did not have to end in Tucson, and the geographic footprint of the investigation confirms investigators knew that from the beginning. And this is not the response you generate for a single opportunist who spotted a vulnerable elderly woman. This is the response for a planned operation with the resources, the preparation, and the inside knowledge to move across a wide geographic range. And the question of who had that inside knowledge has been sitting in the confirmed record since January 11th. Come back to 9:50 p.m. one more time. The garage door coming down. On the morning of that same day, a vehicle was near her home before she left for dinner. 3 weeks of surveillance had preceded that morning. The back doors that were found propped open the next day had been propped at some point by someone for a reason. The ransom note was already written. The Bitcoin wallet was already set up. The payment deadline was already calculated. By 9:50 p.m., the people responsible were not on their way. They had been circling for 20 days, and when that garage door came down, it did not close Nancy inside a safe home. It closed her inside the final phase of something that had been building since January 11th. The insider said it plainly. There is currently no direct suspect, no name on the table, and they said it is not surprising given how this investigation started. The case was botched in the first hours, and cases are sometimes made by the thinnest of margins. The smallest piece of evidence that was never collected, because the first team was treating a crime scene like a search zone. The footprint in the driveway that got walked over. The hair on the bed sheets that nobody thought to collect because they were looking for someone who wandered away. But the science is still running. The DNA is still being processed. The genetic genealogy is building 2 family trees. The cell tower data from January 23rd is being cross-referenced against February 1st. The Uber dash cam is being analyzed frame by frame. None of it requires the investigation to have been handled perfectly to produce a result. It requires time, and it is running. Nancy Guthrie came back to that house on the night of January 31st. The pajamas are there to prove it. But she did not come back to safety. She walked into a crime that had spent 3 weeks preparing for her. A crime designed by someone who knew her home, knew her family, knew her Saturday night routine, and knew exactly how an inexperienced first response team would read a scene built to look ambiguous. And she never came back to the life she left when she walked out that door at 5:32 p.m. That version of Nancy, safe, unaware, living the ordinary life of a woman who had dinner with her daughter on Saturday nights, that version never came home. What came home at 9:50 p.m. stepped into something that had already decided on her. And the confirmed record of this investigation has been pointing at that truth since the first press conference. Hidden inside a word a sheriff used once and nobody kept. Assume. 62 days. The investigation is still active. The science is still running. And somewhere in Tucson, the person or people who spent 3 weeks watching Nancy Guthrie's home, who staged those back doors, who built a ransom infrastructure before the night began, and who counted on an inexperienced first response to buy them the window they needed, are still waiting to find out if the evidence catches up with what they planned. It is catching up. And when it does, the question the confirmed record has been asking since January 11th will finally have a name attached to it. The question of who knew that property well enough to plan this, who knew that family well enough to research the ransom amount, who knew that investigation well enough to build a scene designed to be misread, and who has been living 4 miles away from Nancy Guthrie's home for 20 years. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 62 days. Her family cannot grieve. They can only wait. And the only thing standing between this case fading into silence and the right person seeing the information that closes it is you. If this video reached you, share it. Not for this channel. For Nancy. Every share puts this case in front of someone who might know something. Every like tells the algorithm this story matters and keeps it moving to new eyes. Every subscriber means that when the next development breaks, and it will break, the update reaches people who are paying attention. The suspect in this case is counting on the world moving on the news cycle forgetting, on 62 days becoming 90 and 90 becoming a year and a year, becoming the kind of case that disappears from the conversation. Do not let that happen. Or subscribe, like, share. Because the attention this case keeps is the pressure the investigation keeps, and Nancy Guthrie deserves every bit of both until she is brought home.